Hello and welcome to the Libertarian Perspective, a discussion of state, local, and national issues with a libertarian flair. My name is Doug Klippel. I'm the former state chairman of the Libertarian Party of Florida. Thank you so much for tuning into our broadcast. We actually have a very special broadcast today. Those of you that seen the show before know that a lot of times we talk about different topics and kind of bounce around from state, local, and national issues. We're actually going to take this show to focus on just one topic, and that topic is the Fairtax. And it's very topical that we actually do this because this show is going to be airing in March, leading up to the dreaded April 15th tax season, something that should strike fear in the heart of all Americans. I've read surveys where the top phobias are fear of death, fear of heights, and in the top 4 or 5 normally is a fear of being audited. So maybe our guest will have some information to give to us today. I'd like to introduce Bob Frenzel, who's a volunteer with Fairtax. Bob, really appreciate you blocking out some time to be on our broadcast today.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah. Just very quickly, Bob, why don't you give us a little bit about your background and just why you became interested in this Fairtax movement?
Sure. It started probably about 5 years ago when I first heard about the Fairtax on the radio, picked up the Fairtax book and read it. And it made so much sense to me because I had spent 10 years in Washington and understand how the process works. And just the fact that we could move the collection part of taxation out of the politicians' hands is a huge benefit from my perspective.
Absolutely, and certainly going to look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. We've actually got a lot of things we're going to talk about tax-wise and Fairtax-wise. We actually have an overhead that we're going to go ahead and put up that talks about some of the things that we're going to cover today. Just very, very briefly, going to talk about the history of the income tax in America. It's always amazing to me how few people actually know about the history of the income tax in America and the constitutional implications of an income tax. We're going to have some facts on the income tax. That's almost a rhyme, and boy, if this doesn't leave you with a nauseous feeling in your stomach, some of these facts I'm going to show up, I'm not sure what would. We're going to talk very briefly about this concept about is everybody paying their fair share. We've got a breakdown of tax burden by income level that I think the viewers will find interesting. And then, Bob, we're really going to get into a discussion of the actual Fairtax proposal. That's where we're going to look to your expertise and for you to provide some information. Some benefits and some potential concerns of the Fairtax, and then finally, how the viewers out there can get involved if like you, they become interested in this topic and want to jump in with both
Sounds
feet.
good.
All right.
Sounds good.
Well, let's just take it from the top then in terms of a history of the income tax, and we actually do have another overhead that we're going to put up about this. A lot of folks don't know that the first U.S. income tax was actually opposed during the Civil War and again in the 1890s. There's actually a lot of legal challenges over the years because the Constitution actually prohibits what's called a direct tax without apportioning it among the states or basing it on the census. So in other words, something that was a tax that had to be applied uniformly across the entire states and be based on the census. So there were a lot of court cases around that, and it actually wasn't until 1913 when the 16th Amendment, an actual constitutional amendment, was applied that actually allowed, if you will, a quote-unquote constitutional basis for levying the income tax. I know the 16th Amendment is something that the Fairtax folks are interested in repealing, and we're going to get into that when we actually get to talk about you. The next overhead, just some very, very quick facts about the U.S. income tax today. And again, if this doesn't leave people shaking their heads, I'm not exactly sure what would. The figures here are even a little bit dated, so I mean, I would imagine the situation has gotten worse, not better. The point of comparison we have is 1995 to 2008. And really, from every criteria that you can see listed there, from the number of pages in the tax code to the compliance cost to the pages in the instruction booklet of the 1040 form, to the number of hours spent on tax compliance, just absolutely incredible. And this system, Bob, is so complex that people are increasingly having to go to outside tax preparers and get people involved. We see the revenue for H&R Block, $740 million in 1995, $2.2 billion in 2008. I would imagine that as we talk about the Fairtax, just getting it implemented, one of the things you're going to have to do is actually, can't call it a cottage industry, you're going to have to take on this industry of tax preparers, tax lawyers, and people that benefit from the system the way that it's currently put together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So just absolutely, absolutely incredible. And then our next slide, are you paying your fair share? And this is 2007 data, so this is also a little bit dated. You can see that more and more this tax burden is falling on fewer and fewer people. That I think has to be one of the real takeaways from this. We know right now that some research studies show that it's close to 50% of the people right now get by without paying any income tax at all. Now, obviously, as a libertarian, I'm not a fan of the income tax, but for me, when you have a increasing percentage of the population that doesn't have any skin in the game, if you want to call that are not, paying into the system, there's really no limit on the fact that they might want to vote themselves more benefits and things along those lines because they're actually not having to pay for those type of
Absolutely,
benefits.
yeah.
Is that a concern that you share as well?
Absolutely, and that's why the Fairtax puts that burden across everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, from a libertarian perspective, from a kind of traditional American perspective or whatever, I think our founding fathers would be turning over in their graves if they knew that there was an office of the federal government like the IRS with its Gestapo-like powers, its abuses of liberty, and frankly the poor track record that that agency has in terms of its interaction with the citizenry of this country.
Sure, it was a lot of the reasons why they came here in the first place.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, the IRS actually launched a customer service initiative where they were going to be more customer friendly and all that kind of stuff. But as the demands on them to squeeze more tax dollars and find more tax cheats and get more revenues, that initiative has gone out the door, and if anything, they've taken a much more brass knuckles approach. I've even read about the fact that they have informant programs, where they actually encourage people who maybe suspect a friend or a neighbor, maybe even a family member, of not complying to actually, phone an 800 number and kind of turn these folks in.
Sure.
Again, I think both you and I would say not exactly an American principle or not exactly an American way of doing things.
Right.
So with all that as backdrop, we've got the complexity of the current tax code. We've got the fact that there's hundreds of thousands of hours of compliance cost and millions and billions of dollars in compliance cost. We've got the fact that we've got a tax code that if it was in this studio right now, which probably has a 30-foot high ceiling, if you stack the tax code, you probably couldn't fit it all in one spot. You've got a system where people phone the IRS for tax advice and are given incorrect advice over half of the time. They're still responsible for not complying, even if they get the wrong advice, all right? You've got this, agency with Gestapo-like powers, which is certainly in violation of the American spirit. And then here comes something that is called the Fairtax.
Right.
And we're going to put up a slide here that just has some of the tenets of the Fairtax. It basically replaces federal income and payroll taxes with a 23% national sales tax. There is a prebate, so in other words, a check is given to those who fall below the poverty level. Dollar for dollar revenue neutrality, so if anything, I actually think if anything it's probably going to add more revenue to the federal government as opposed to taking anything away. And as part of this movement, we also have the repeal of the 16th Amendment. Just very, very quickly go to the next slide, the benefits of the Fairtax. Workers keep their entire paychecks, retirees with their entire pensions, accountability to tax policy, refunds in advance taxes on necessities, and as we just said, abolishes the IRS. And I think a big one is shows the true cost of government. I think if people actually go to a store and they get a receipt and that tax amount is listed every single time they buy something, they might come to the realization of how much all this quote-unquote free stuff is actually costing us. Because you ask the average person on the street right now, how much do they pay in taxes? They have no idea, and the reason is it's taken out automatically. They probably only think about it during tax time. Some people even say, oh, I don't pay anything, I get money back, which is just absolutely shocking.
Yes.
So we've gone over, what some of the major principles of the Fairtax are, what some of the benefits are. Your comments on those?
Just to clarify a few things. The Fairtax replaces all income taxes and payroll taxes with a 23% sales tax. It's a national consumption tax. But that is the key component of the Fairtax is that it's tied to this prebate. Sales taxes are regressive in and of themselves because people who make less money are going to pay a higher proportion of their income in the form of sales taxes than someone who makes more. Yes. So the idea behind the Fairtax was to create this prebate to make it progressive so that everyone, so it's kind of like the standard deduction that we have today. So not only the people who are below the poverty level, but everyone benefits from the prebate.